I've been wanting to share with you today in particular, because it is today, December the 14th, 2021, that is 8 years since George passed away in 2013. And in particular, I've been thinking a long time about sharing this painting, and today seemed like the appropriate time to share it. It is one of George's last paintings. It has a tremendous amount of meaning, and really his entire life's message is, in my opinion, encapsulated within this one work. So in thinking about how to approach this, I think there's really three ways to go about it. First is I'm going to go over some of the basic Rodrigue elements that are present here, because they're really all present here. And then I thought I'd read a bit from my journal as I wrote at the time when George painted this, and talk to him about it. So we'll hear some of his words. And finally, I'd like to share with you what I see in this painting today. So this piece is called He Stopped Loving Her Today. And it encapsulates, as I mentioned, really George's entire painting direction, all the way from the late 1960s up until the time of his death 8 years ago. Most prominent, of course, other than the blue dog, is this magnificent oak tree. George very much saw this not only as a symbol of Louisiana, but a symbol of his own career. It's prevalent throughout his entire career. He painted it in a very distinctive manner. First of all, these very hard edges defining the shape. He also made a real point of saying that these spaces in between the branches, these shapes are just as important as the shape of the tree itself. He often, as I've mentioned to you before, expressed that his paintings were primarily about contrast. So you have this very distinctive contrast of the light versus the dark and these shapes of the trees, as well as this hard edge versus a very painterly background of this kind of glowing sky in the distance. By cutting his tree off at the top, which is very distinctive Rodrigue, he not only enables us to have this sky in the distance, but also allows us to enter the work. It's as though we are with him beneath his tree in this Louisiana landscape. Now, why the importance of the sky in the distance? And again, this applies to all Rodrigue landscapes going back to the 60s. If there is this light in the distance, in the beginning, in his early works, he spoke about that as being the hope of the Cajun people in traveling from, after the Grand Arrangement of 1755, their persecution by the British in Canada, traveling from Canada into South Louisiana, not knowing what they would find. And that was important to him because his ancestors did that. So this light in the distance represents, certainly in his early landscapes and Cajun works, that hope. Years later, as George developed as a painter, he spoke about this light as being the hope for all people, that tomorrow would be better than today, and perhaps the next day better than that. And of course, in a painting this late in George's life, perhaps it represents another kind of hope. He was very sick with his cancer by this time. And then some other very distinctive Rodrigue elements. You see this here. Is it a river? Is it a road leading to this light, this hope in the distance, leading us as we enter the painting to that light, to that hope? It doesn't matter if it's a river or a road. For the Cajuns, of course, the river was the road. Also very distinctive Rodrigue elements, the rhythm of the moss, as he often talked about, often echoed within the roots of the trees. And here we have the roots of the trees echoing almost exactly the feet of the dog. Tying the land to this very strong presence. We have the dog sitting on a tombstone. George, it was so interesting because he did not like funerals. We went to only 2 funerals all the years that we were together, 25 years, and, well, 21 years. It's 25 years that we will have been married this March 1st. Anyway, he didn't like funerals. He was very, not that anyone really likes them, but he was very uncomfortable with them. But the tombs took him all the way back to his childhood. George's father came from a very large family, and when one of the brothers died, he inherited the tomb business. And so when George was growing up, that was a big part of his, particularly teenage years. In fact, one of the jobs his dad gave him was when the cemeteries would flood, George would go out and, at the direction of his father, and when the tombs popped up in the water, use a sledgehammer to knock off a corner, sinking it for good. Anyway, these tombs, it's quite a vision, isn't it, of George and his waders going out on his own with a sledgehammer in the water and doing this. It made a real impression on him, and he painted the tombs throughout above-ground Louisiana tombs. And of course the blue dog, and we know the whole history of this, that it first came from the loup-garou, but became very much something else. So what has it become here? Well, it's wearing a tie. Dogs don't wear ties. Women can wear ties, of course, and do, but clearly this is representative of a man on this tomb. So who is it representing? This very glowing dog, glowing like the Cajuns. George used to say that he painted his Cajuns all in white, not because they were lit from the outside, but because they glowed from within of their culture. Well, here the dog is clearly glowing from within, almost neon, and there is no variation in tone whatsoever in this dog. It is very, very distinctively bright and electric even, as opposed to all of the nuances going on within this painting. He is trying very much, George is, to represent something very strong here, the strongest. Distinctive Rodrigue elements. Let's talk about this with George's own words. So George painted this in May of 2012. In April of 2012, we were driving back from Louisiana to California, and on the way we stopped in Houston for him to have a PET scan. He had been in remission. His cancer had since the previous fall, and we learned at that time that his cancer had returned. But we made the decision together to tell no one. No one knew. Not for quite some time. And we got back to California, and George said, I don't want to think about it, Wendy. I don't want to talk about it. I just want to paint. Well, literally within days after we returned, the great singer, songwriter, George Jones died. And my George, was a big fan of George Jones. And he thought for a long time that he wanted to do something. And he painted this over the course of a week, hardly sleeping, which of course really worried me because he was so sick. But well, anyway, he was very dedicated to this work. And after he finished it, I asked him about it. I interviewed him about it for my blog. And not wanting to, again, share with anyone that his cancer had returned, this is what he said very distinctly about it. I wanted to paint a tribute to George Jones. I've loved this song for 30 years, and even though I've painted the blue dog before on tombs, this one is particularly special because I reference the woman he loves. Her hat is a remembrance alongside his grave. So that brings us back to the distinctive Rodrigue element. The hat is clearly Jolie Blonde's hat. Jolie Blonde, of course, was truly George's Cajun embodiment, along with Evangeline. He painted Jolie Blonde going all the way back to 1974, This is actually a sketch from 1974 from, as far as I know, his first rendition of her. He absolutely made her up, and he did a painting from this drawing that many of you may be familiar with, his most famous of her. He made her up. He did go on to paint her many times, hundreds of times throughout his career, and I was very honored to be his model for Jolie Blonde for many years. Her hat is a remembrance alongside his grave. After I made those few notes for my blog, George and I remember the day very well. Again, this was in May of 2012. And we sat there talking about the painting. George brought it into the living room. He hung it on the wall where it stayed until he died. He never offered it for sale. It was very important to him. And we were just sitting there visiting about the painting and just talking about life. And I recalled to him something I had just heard. I had just been watching a documentary. It was actually an interview with Martha Gellhorn. Martha Gellhorn, for those of you who don't know, was a war correspondent, an American war correspondent during World War II, and a woman at that, quite a remarkable woman. And the interviewer asked her why he was not allowed to ask her about her ex-husband, who was also a war correspondent, and the quite famous Ernest Hemingway. And she said something that really resonated for me. And I was telling George this as we looked at this painting. She said, "Because I refuse to be a footnote to someone else's life." Thought a lot about that. And I was telling George about this that day, as I recalled in my journal. And I said, "George, I thought about this, and I want you to know I am really happy being your footnote." And he said something that he told me so many times during our relationship. I mean, countless times. He would get mad at me. And he said, "When are you going to realize who you are?" That's a weird thing for me to share with you, but it's the truth. That's what he said. And then he continued. He said, "The difference with us, Wendy, is that we put our feelings for each other above everything else, even our personal ambitions." And I looked at him and I whispered, because I was so shocked, "Say that again." So what do I see in this painting today? I grabbed Kleenex this time because I knew, please forgive me. Well, obviously, this is George. And Jolie Blonde's hat, my hat, is remembered alongside his grave. George is off on the next adventure, the next part of his journey. And this is a bright golden horizon. He is glowing. He is strong in the blue dog, which is how he continues to live. As I've said many times, George's words, art takes on a life of its own long after the artist is gone. And what of me? Well, in those last few weeks of George's life, I used to crawl in his hospital bed at night, and I would put my head on his ribcage, on his chest. He had this enormous ribcage, even as he lost weight with his cancer. And I would match my breathing to his, trying to give him my strength, give him my breath. And this one night, and he was so sick, I said to him, "Thank you, George. Thank you for this wonderful life." And he said, "I didn't give you a life, Wendy. I only gave you half a life. Thank you, Douglas, for filming this. Thank you for this half of my life. Thank you for saving my life and for your tremendous love. Thank you to George for all those things as well. And thank you to you who are watching. Thank you for everyone who supports Life and Legacy. I really appreciate that in every way. And I wish to all of you your own happiness, your own ease with the changes that come in life, because they do come. I wish you freedom in expressing your creativity. I wish you courage to meet your fears. George taught me that. And above all, I wish you enjoy